I thought it'd be fun today to go through the tech that I'm focused on learning right now. This is definitely going to be a longer video, so I will put timestamps down below. If you want to jump to a specific section, I'm going to be talking a lot about dev tools, AWS stuff, kind of Elixir Phoenix, and also generally how I'm thinking about applications and building them. I think this will be a fun one, but again, use the timestamps, and yeah. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is definitely going to be kind of dev tools and dev environment setup stuff. Now, I have always been, if you've watched my videos, you've definitely seen this. I have been a VS Code guy for a long time. I do most of my work in here. It works really well for me, but I don't quite use it in its base configuration. I have it really nicely set up. I use Vim motions on here, so I'm super comfortable with that. I've set up a lot of custom keybinds for like jumping between files. I can use like leader key of space to S to jump into my search, like if I wanted to go to my SSD config or something like that. I have it nicely set up with the workbench toggle. I have my tab switching really nicely set up. The whole thing is pretty dialed in for what I want, but I've really just for the longest time wanted to make the final leap and go up to Neovim. I've tried to do this multiple times, but every single time there just end up being weird and annoying pieces of friction on there that I just don't end up enjoying. Always just kind of been the basic VS Code, basic keyboard, normal type stuff guy. I want to give the really crazy split keyboard, Tmux, Neovim, all the crazy flashy stuff set up a try. I don't know if I'll end up liking it. Maybe it'll be great. Maybe it won't be. I've seen compelling arguments both directions, but I want to try it for myself. So what I'm kind of doing here is I'm trying to go through and kind of bring myself into this gradually. So obviously I've always been using Vim motions and VS Code, so that's super easy. Then the next sort of thing I've been doing is I've been trying to update my keyboard. For the longest time, I've been using this thing. It's just like a basic Logitech keyboard, but I'm really trying to get used to using this thing. I think I've had this in the background of videos for a while. It's my Advantage 360 from Kinesis. I got it like a year ago, and I've tried it multiple times. I've tried to get into it and I've never been able to, but recently for like the last month or so, I've been daily driving this and really getting into it. So I've finally gotten to the point where I can really use and enjoy this keyboard. I really like this sort of idea of just trying to put as much on keyboard shortcuts as I can. If you're on Mac OS, I highly recommend this extension called Warp. It's basically a little app where you can bind to, like for me, it's on Alt space. I just hit this and it gives me a nice little search bar. It's similar to Spotlight, except it doesn't suck. I can jump into different apps. If I wanted to open up VS Code, I can do that. It also has a lot of nice little extensions that I use. One of them that's really convenient since I'm doing a bunch of content creation stuff is like searching for different logos and stuff for different pieces of tech. This is very helpful for making thumbnails. And yeah, it's just a nice little companion to help me keep hands on keyboard. If you've watched my videos before, you've probably seen me like swipe between different apps or whatever. I was just doing that with my mouse here. I would just swipe between them with the little side button, but now I've kind of set it so that I don't have those animations turned on and I can just jump around with like control arrow keys and stuff like that. And it's just this kind of general idea of trying to have a more dialed in dev setup where I can more comfortably jump between my windows, between my browser, between my terminals and stuff like that. And the next evolution of that is very much going to be kind of Tmux and Neovim, so I can really dial this in. That's going to be definitely a process. I will hopefully have this fully implemented by the end of the year, and I'll make a follow-up video on how that felt and whether or not it was worth jumping from my admittedly very nice, very well set up VS Code instance. I mean, this really, I don't have any problems with this. I just think it's fun. Now to get into what is probably the bulk of this video, and this is going to be talking about AWS and Elixir and Phoenix. And I know that these don't seem too naturally related, but really the whole impetus for this is for the rest of the year, I want to get deeper into understanding the way a real, more complicated app works in all the different facets and pieces beyond just like the basic CRUD logic, all the different things it needs, how the cron jobs work, how the database works, how the event queues work, how all the different services that make apps run work and the different ways to put these together. I think the best way to sort of introduce this section is definitely going to be kind of talking about the way at least I'm mentally thinking of how an app is built these days. Any generic app is generally speaking going to need an API to serve data down. It's going to need templating to display out content to the end user. It's going to need queues to manage background workers and stuff like that, to manage jobs that are too slow to run in the basic API. It's going to need cron jobs to handle scheduled events. It's going to need an email system. It's going to need an authentication system. It's going to need a database, and there is plenty more stuff we could add in here. We could talk about vector DBs. We could talk about an LLM service. We could talk about a caching system. We could talk about a CloudFront gateway, a CDN. We could talk about a reverse proxy. There's a bajillion more things we can talk about, but I feel like this is enough for me to kind of make the point I'm trying to make here. And the way I've been thinking about this is there's a couple different ways you can do it. The way I have always kind of, at least I kind of grew up, quote unquote, doing this. Because again, I mean, I'm only 22, so I haven't been doing this for that long. I've been doing it about 3 years, mostly self-taught on the web development front. And the way I kind of look at this is in the kind of modern full stack JS way. So let's take like a SvelteKit app, for example, here. So we need to do all of these different things in order to get that SvelteKit app to work. So on the front here, we're going to have a SvelteKit app. That's just going to be our little core right here. And this is going to satisfy the templating and the API. So we're going to handle those two things in our SvelteKit app, but it can't handle everything. We're going to need services or something to handle all these different other parts. I guess you could argue that auth can be handled directly by this. I am kind of leaning towards that like custom hand rolling your auth type solution. Watch my latest video before this if you want a deeper look into how I'm feeling about that with the sunsetting of Lucia. But these things right here, SvelteKit can't handle these out of the box. It's basically just a really nice routing system and a really great client-side framework. So we have to go through and implement these somehow. And that will result in us having back here, we're going to have a DB of some sort. We're going to have a cron service. We're probably going to have a queue system of some sort, and then we're probably going to have an email system of some sort. And the way that a lot of applications are built these days, at least the way I like to think of the like quote unquote AWS wrappers, is these are all functions that you can make happen with AWS. But the way a lot of modern applications I've seen get developed, and I've done this myself, and I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad thing, is you will have your full stack JS framework up here, and then you'll stitch together a bunch of different services to handle this. So you would end up using some Q SaaS to do this. You would end up using some cron SaaS to do this. You would end up using like a resend or something like that to do your email. And then you'd end up using a database provider like a Postgres or a PlanetScale or something along those lines to handle your database. And now for me personally, I think this is the one where like I would definitely most certainly want to use a service. I've used RDS for Insider Viz. We're shipping it right now, and it sucks. It feels really expensive and not that great for what we're getting. Frankly, I've had a much better experience with, I mean, literally any other managed database provider I've worked with, even the like non-managed ones, even just like the basic Postgres instances on Railway were way better than this. And they don't have like basically any features in there, at least that I know of, other than just like, here's basically a Docker container with a Postgres database in it, have fun. RDS just freaking sucks. I have not liked working with it at all. So I think this is a valuable one. But, there's been a lot of discourse lately on like, is it valuable to pay a bunch of money to outsource these different things when we could just do these in AWS? And that's really what I'm talking about when I say I want to get deeper into AWS, is I'm trying to architect my applications in a way where I have my little full stack JS framework up here at the front, but then instead of stitching together a bunch of different SaaSes, I'm just stitching together AWS resources, because at the end of the day, that's kind of what they're doing. Although that is a gross oversimplification. There is a lot of value that a lot of these different companies add. But at least, for what I'm trying to experiment with, I want to see if I can get away with doing it without those. And the tool I've been using to do this actually has been SST. I think this has been, I'm currently building out the new backend for Block. I've built this like a bunch of different times. We had a big monorepo system doing like the Next.js app serving a tRPC router that was then being consumed by a React Native app. And it sucked. It was not pleasant to work with. I did not like it. So we're migrating over to just a more standard traditional backend. It's just an API written in Hono, and we're using the Open API Swagger auto documentation to get that end-to-end type safety without having to go through and do all of the crazy legwork that comes with a monorepo serving tRPC back and forth. As awesome as tRPC is, I think it's great in like web apps, but bridging the gap over to mobile really didn't feel that great. But in this project, we're actually using SST to handle our backend. This is all basically written in AWS. We're using Supabase for our database just because I really like it. But outside of that, we are just using basically raw AWS resources and custom authentication. So we have our basic app information up here, but the interesting stuff down here is, like I said, we need to stitch all these different pieces together because Block it does a lot of scheduling stuff. It works with calendars. So we need to be able to handle syncing a user's calendar back and forth from Google Calendar. So I have this calendar queue, this event queue, all these different queues, which I just define with code in here. And then I can create those actual handlers within my queue directory here. And then they just kind of do the trick. This way I can go through via infrastructure as code. I'm actually creating an Amazon SQS queue right here, and I'm subscribing to it by creating a Lambda handler, which will get invoked from my SQS queue. And if I want to invoke this queue anywhere within the calendar sync or whatever, if I wanted to sync a certain profile's calendar, this is a guarded route, don't worry. We can just go in here and just send an SQS message. So we're just going to do sqs.send, new message command, and then we pass in our resources URL, pass in our message body, and then it'll handle it. So it's basically going through and architecting all of these different pieces in AWS. Another way you could do this is by using like event-driven systems, which will go through and kind of handle this stuff for you. Versus here, we're just doing it at the raw AWS level. We also have cron jobs down here to go through and sync user calendars in the background. And then we also have our API layer up here, which is just getting served through Lambda. So this is a pretty cool way of doing things. Again, I'm pretty new to this and how I'm doing this. I've only been working with this for like a couple weeks or so. It's been a very recent upgrade, but I've been really impressed with it so far. It's a very cool way of doing things. I'm definitely not here to be the guy who's like, oh, just do everything in AWS. It's so much easier and better and blah, blah, blah. It sucks in a lot of ways. I mean, even SST is definitely a much happier path than raw custom doing this in Terraform or just, God forbid, through the console. It's definitely a much nicer experience, but it's still AWS. It's still having to create IAM credentials. It's still having to go through and do stuff in their dashboard. And it is like, there is more friction here than there is when you're working with these nice a la carte managed services. There just is. But really what I'm trying to suss out here is this good enough that it's worth a trade-off of the worse experience to create a more powerful product? Because that's something too, is, AWS has solved all of these problems. They have everything in there. I can build basically whatever I want. If I can get a decent level of understanding and mastery of the core pieces of AWS, of SQS, of Lambda, of the cron functions, I mean, that's really kind of what you need, generally speaking, to build most stuff. There's definitely other services in there that I could use, but I can make most stuff I want with that and not really have to leave it, and it will be much more reasonably priced and have a lot more power behind it. So that's the kind of modern JS AWS type route. And then the other kind of side of this is why I wanted to talk about Elixir and Phoenix and why I've been playing with this is the kind of other way of doing web development. This is something where I am very new to this and I am really not a domain expert at all in this. I want to give that caveat because I've been playing with this for like a couple weeks. And most of my understanding and knowledge of this stuff is very much secondhand, just from watching a bunch of videos and reading a bunch of stuff. So don't take any of this as gospel, but it's just my general understanding and thoughts on this kind of thing. But in the other sort of way of thinking about how an app can be built, like we have this kind of way of exploding out all these services and linking them together in the full stack JS world, is the sort of monolithic model where like I think Rails does this, Laravel does this, and Phoenix does this, where we take all of these different features and we just put them into one application. In this Phoenix app, we have our cron jobs, we have our queue, we have an email sender. The database isn't quite written in there, but they have an adapter and an ORM for it. That's another thing I didn't even really cover in this section, where like you have to bring in a bunch of third-party packages just to get all this stuff to work together. That's not inherently a bad thing because it does create almost like a Unix type model where like you can go through and use whatever different pieces you want. You can pick from a dozen different ORMs. You could pick Drizzle or Prisma or Raw SQL, whatever you want to do. Same thing with email. There's a bajillion different services. There's loops, there's resend, there's Plunk. Same thing with its queues, same thing with crons, and also same thing with the front end framework. SvelteKit is my personal framework of choice. It's by far my favorite of the ones I've used. I've used Nuxt a little bit. I've used Next.js very heavily, and I've used SvelteKit very heavily. Very much prefer SvelteKit, not a huge fan of the others. But again, you have options there. You can kind of mix and match these pieces to create whatever you want. And that is kind of nice Versus over here, it's a very all-in-one experience from my understanding and what I've seen, where like, you know, Phoenix has Ecto, the built-in ORM to handle your database and your repo and stuff like that. It has a built-in mail service. It has an opinion on how to do queues, how to do different cron jobs, all these different things. It's packaged into this one nice kind of framework that just does it all in one place. And then you kind of containerize all this stuff and you can just host it out to wherever you want. This is very much something where like you could easily stick this onto like a $5 VPS or something like that. You could kind of do that in like the full stack JS world, but I don't know if any of the major frameworks honestly would support that to get all of these features built into it without having to do a lot of work and it being really painful. So realistically, you're probably going to want to explode out your infra to use these kind of modern day services from AWS or from an AWS wrapper, at least from what I've seen and what I've done. Versus over here, you know, you kind of just make your Phoenix app, you put it all together and you run it. And I wanted to try this. I really want to kind of put these two different methodologies back to back and see how they both feel. This is how I've been building forever. And this, you know, there's a lot of people online who are very, very vocally for this kind of application development. And I wanted to give it a shot. I don't want to just blindly write it off. And there's also just a lot of other really cool technical things in the Elixir Phoenix world, which I want to talk about. When I was kind of thinking about the different ways apps are built and how we do this stuff, I needed to pick some full stack framework to decide, you know, what I want to do, which one I want to invest in. And the kind of the three that came to mind were Rails, Laravel, or Phoenix. And my decision kind of came down to like, I used Rails for a semester in college. I hated it. It was not for me. Too much magic. I don't really like Ruby as a language. It was too dynamically typed. It just, it wasn't for me. It just didn't click. It's not how I like doing things. Laravel, I don't want PHP on my computer. It's just, it's not, there's no good technical reasons behind that. I just don't want it on my computer. I'm good. And then the final one was Elixir Phoenix. I'd heard amazing things about it from people I really look up to and respect, so I wanted to give it a shot. And I started by kind of playing around with Elixir, and it is really cool. I want to kind of nerd out about this and talk about some of this stuff here, because there's some really cool stuff in here in like functional programming world. Because for some background on what I've been doing programming wise forever is I've always kind of lived in OOP world. When I was in college, we really leaned into OOP stuff. Like I'm going to make a video dedicated to this pretty soon, I think, like the kind of modern CSE college experience. But like the core software class for us was the most OOP class you could ever imagine. Like we were doing abstract classes. We were implementing 4 different implementations into the abstract class. We were doing all of the different OOP things. We were doing heavy unit testing on the abstract class and the different implementations and how all it worked. And in the very contrived examples we were doing, it was pretty cool. But like, I don't know, I've never been the biggest fan of OOP, and for most of the time these days, especially I'm at work, I'm just writing JavaScript or really TypeScript, and it's not super OOP'd up, but it's not super functional either. I've never really played with a functional language before. So when I went in to try out Elixir and do some stuff here, it's so freaking cool, the stuff you can do in this. I really enjoyed this. So the first example I'll give here that really blew my mind is like the pattern matching stuff. So right here, I've implemented the power function recursively. Functional languages lean really heavily into recursion, which I'm a huge fan of because I really like recursion. I thought that was one of the most fun parts of the CS degree and those classes was playing with recursion and learning how to do that on these different problems. It's funny, one of the first videos I ever actually made way back when, like a year and a half ago, was on recursion and the way I think about it. And it's an old video. It didn't get many views for obvious reasons, but I think it actually is a pretty good video breaking down the way I think about it. And the example I always use for recursion that made it click for me is power. So I went ahead and the first implementation I did in Elixir is the way you would do this in like JavaScript or in any language I was familiar with, where you would basically just have an if statement here where it's like, okay, the base case, if p equals 0, we return 1. And then otherwise, we return the recursive call here of n to the p minus 1 times n. Basic stuff. But what you can do in Elixir, which is really, really cool when I friggin' saw this, is you can define the function multiple times and then it will call the correct function based on the arguments. So I can say in this case, I can define the power function when p equals 0, just return 1. Otherwise, when you call the power function and p isn't equal to 0, we just return the recursive call right here. So we can just do this like pattern, we can just do this functional pattern matching, which was so freaking cool. And I think actually there might be a way for me to rewrite this to just be, instead of having to do the when case, I can just do 0. So when p equals 0, I can just literally do this. So we can just do def power is that, and then I'm going to jump over to my terminal here. And what's really, really dope about this is if I just do math.power 2 to the third, which will be 8, we type that in, and then we'll get 8 correctly because it went through the recursive calls and it just pattern matched to the right things. And you can do things like iterate over loops with this. You can go through and like in here, when I was doing some IO testing, I can go through and define like right here, I can define, okay, so this case of, so in this case of file.read, and what's really cool about this is since it's so functional, at least my understanding is that every time you like call something like this, like file.read is calling a function and this file.read returns some value. So it's returning this okay or a binary, or it's returning an error. So in this case, I can just put basically a case, an if statement on what's returned from this file.read, but we're still reading that file. And then we handle the results of what we called accordingly. So in this case, so if we did find the file, we get in the okay case. So when we match this, we just print out the body of the file. Otherwise, if we match the error case and the reason equals the file wasn't found, we print out that the file wasn't found. And then just the base case of like, okay, there's an error and we don't know what happened, we just print out an unknown error. And we go through and just actually call this function and we run it, we're going to get that the file wasn't found because in this case, it's not there. There's no path to file hello or whatever. But if I change this to be readme.md, we do hello world dot file reading, and then we put that in here, and then I'll just print out my readme. Like it just works. This kind of way of thinking about programs and doing stuff really clicks with me, and I think it's really, really freaking cool. So that's why I chose Elixir, and I'm spending a bunch of time with the language. I really want to get good at it. It seems like the community on this language isn't huge. I don't hear that much about it, but from what I've seen, it's really, really solid. I won't get into all of it in this video, but there's just a lot of good stuff here. Like the live book project for Elixir, like the Elixir live books or whatever. Like these basically seem like Jupyter notebooks, just borderline, at least from what I can see here and what I've played with in a basic level, these are really, really nice. And that's not even getting into the Phoenix framework, which is kind of the whole reason why I went down this tangent. The Phoenix framework, I've heard a lot of really good stuff about. I went ahead and I've tested it out a couple times. I've been playing with it, going through, I read through their full like documentation and tutorials, did all that stuff. Gotta say, the learning curve of getting into this is rough. When I got into SvelteKit or whatever, and admittedly it's the same JS ecosystem, so it's not that bad, but like I was productive and feeling pretty good within like an hour on it, like if even that. Like it didn't take that long. Same thing with Nux, with any of these things. They're not too dissimilar from each other, and they do a really nice job of kind of incrementally bringing you into doing the thing. Versus when I first booted up this, and partially it's because I don't know the language super well and I had to learn a bunch about the language. I have a much better understanding now, so it works better. Like I actually kind of get what's going on in like this mount function. But you know, getting into this initially was a huge shock to the system. Like you bootstrap an app and you get so many different files and all this different stuff. And it took me a while to kind of get to the point where I'm actually able to do stuff. It was definitely like 10 hours or so of really kind of going through, doing a lot of reading, a lot of testing, a lot of playing with, to get to the point where I generally understand what's going on, but I'm still not, I wouldn't consider myself productive with this at all. Like if you told me to in a weekend, like I had to go build something useful in SvelteKit land with the JS stack, I could easily do it, no problem. Versus with this, I'm not there yet. It's going to take a while, but I can see the kind of logic behind it. And of all these full stack frameworks, at least from what I've seen, this one is the closest to what I'm looking for and has some really cool stuff in it. I'm not going to talk too much about like the ORM or the controllers or anything like that. What I want to talk about actually is going to be live view. And I think this is pretty new. But what's really cool about this, if you look at it and you don't worry too much about the syntax, this looks shockingly similar to like a React style functional component. We have our render function where actually maybe it's closer to like a class component, but this isn't a class, but you get what I'm saying. But we have like this render function right here where we're basically printing out some template. This is using the Elixir templating language, the HEX templates, which one big gripe I have and something I want to learn in other, hopefully try and rectify in like Neovim or something, is the autocomplete on this sucks. Like it doesn't auto close the div for me. I have to do that manually. And like that's a little thing, but writing real templates and doing a bunch of stuff in here, that would get really old. The editor and developer experience is just not quite there because I think it's just a smaller community and ecosystem. But again, we have our little render function here, and then we have a mount function. And what we're basically doing here is we're setting up like some state. So if you imagine this like in Svelte, we were defining a state variable of temperature, and then we were going through and we were having a handle event to increase the temperature and to decrease the temperature. Pretty basic stuff. It makes sense. Except the cool and weird and very different part of this is that instead of the state living just in client-side JavaScript, we're writing Elixir here, and the state is actually living on the server. So if I go back into my terminal here, and I just did mix phx.server to start my server, I'll go in here, boot up my live view application. We'll go to localhost 4000, open this up. If I go to my thermostat page here, I get my little basic UI for keeping track of my temperature. But if you look at the terminal here, we're actually connecting to a live view socket, and we're going to be keeping track of the state on the server. So when I hit this plus button, I'm actually sending a WebSocket to the server, and it's keeping track of it up there, and it's sending it back and forth. I really don't understand deeply how this works. I need to do a lot more playing with this and a lot more testing, but the general idea of it is really, really cool. I mean, you can see in here, we're handling an event on the server of increasing the temperature. We can pass in different parameters, send back our replies. They have a really nice system for sending very small payloads, and they've optimized this heavily. But again, it's a very different kind of way of doing things, and I wanted to play with that. I wanted to see how this kind of works and feels compared to the kind of doing it all in JS thing. Because frankly, that's something I wanted to see is, you know, is there a really compelling alternative to JavaScript to make really good, very interactive web applications? At least from what I've researched and done and seen, I haven't really seen it. I know that you can do a lot of cool stuff with Rails, with Laravel, obviously with Elixir, Phoenix. There's clearly a lot of potential here, but it just feels to me like, you know, if you want to do really cool stuff in the browser, you kind of need JavaScript. So I wanted to see how this works, how this feels. So I don't really have a super clean and nice way of bringing this all together. Like I said, this is a very ranty and rambly kind of video where I just go through how I'm feeling about all these things. But if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will hopefully talk to you soon.